Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Crowd's Green Recovery Festival. My name's Caroline McFarland. I'm director of the Crowd. The Crowd, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, is a network for business leaders paving the way in sustainability and responsible business. We're really pleased to have Professor Jim Skea, who is opening the festival, and really delighted to have his thoughts and experiences and ideas shared with us. And the session will be chaired by Emily Hickson, who is the Head of Advocacy at the B team. And I'll hand over to Emily in a second. Our spotlight talks are designed to give you a dose of inspiration about the key trends and issues, both in the run-up to COP26 next year, but also more generally a lay of the land when it comes to social, economic and environmental sustainability and the sort of leading ideas in the space. We are streaming on YouTube, as I said, and via social media. So if you are participating on Zoom and have a question, do submit the question via the Q&A function in Zoom. If you're watching online in another capacity, then you can also submit a question using the hashtag #TheCrowd and the hashtag #JimSkea, and we'll feed in your questions into the discussion. But for now, I will hand over to our chair today, Emily Hickson, Head of Advocacy from the B team, who will introduce our speaker, Jim. Thanks so much.
It gives me great pleasure to kick off one of these first Zoom webinars and introduce one of the headliners of the Green Recovery Festival. In a week where lots of us would have been in Glasgow, it's nice to be able to be together online. Being at Glasgow at the COP26, which was supposed to happen this year, that will happen next year in Glasgow. I'm looking forward to seeing everyone there. So let me introduce Jim. So Professor Jim Skea is the co-chair of the Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC. And for those that don't know the IPCC, it's the world's highest authority on climate change science and advises governments all around the world on scientific information pertinent to climate change, mitigation and adaptation. So the working group that Jim is co-chairing covers the mitigation of climate change and is responsible for one of the 3 main reports due in 2021. So I'm sure we're all very much looking forward to those. So Jim is also wearing many hats. He is also the Professor of Sustainable Energy at Imperial College London. He also chairs the Scotland's Just Transition Commission, which is a world-leading Just Transition Commission. And he was also a founding member of the UK Committee on Climate Change. So in this talk, Jim will share insights about the work he's undertaken in the IPCC. He'll explore the kind of links between COVID-19 pandemic and the effects it could have on climate change policy, international climate change policy, and we'll be looking ahead at goals for COP26. So without further ado, can I introduce you, Jim? Take us away. Thank you for headlining this festival, and over to you.
Okay, thanks very much for Emily. And I think as Emily's introduction suggested, I've really set myself up here in terms of ambition, trying to cover climate change, COVID, green recovery and COP26 all in one go. So believe it or not, I am going to attempt to do that by delving into the little bits and pieces that I'm involved in various places at the moment. And if you don't mind, I'll share my screen in order to take us forward. Okay, so these are the things that have been keeping me busy over the last couple of years. So with IPCC, I was involved in producing the special reports on global warming of 1.5 degrees, a special report on climate change and land. I've been chairing the Just Transition Commission, which is still work in progress, but in fact, we produced an interim report on advice for a green recovery back in July. And I'm also a member of a very interesting group called the Friends of COP26, which are a small number of individuals advising the UK Cabinet Office in the COP26 preparations. And you might think that gives you lots of special and privileged insights. Believe me, you would be disappointed if you knew what was actually going on. So what I'm going to do is just to dive into each of these experiences to try to pull something together. Now, I'll start with the IPCC part as first. And, you know, we do have very big ambitions because climate change is a massive global phenomenon. So we need a kind of sweeping vision. But we're also charged with figuring out what it means for ordinary people, families, businesses, and individual governments. So this is a really challenging thing because, you know, on the one hand, you have your head in the clouds. On the other hand, you need to have your feet in the ground for things that are practical and we can allow us to move forward. So this thing about the combination of the sweeping global vision and the practical action, I could be talking about an IPCC report. But this is just a flag. I'm going to be slightly facetious just for the next 2 minutes, but there's a significant point I'm trying to make, is that in IPCC, we assess existing literature. We don't do our own research. So to inspire us at the start of each lead author meeting, we've actually been doing our own literature review to try to get us going and focus us. So when I talk about global vision and practicalities, I might not just be talking about an IPCC report. You could also apply it to another piece of literature. You know, War and Peace by Tolstoy also attempts that major challenge of linking the global and the practical and the bottom up. And you can be a bit facetious about the comparisons between War and Peace and IPCC. Superficial similarities. They're both about 500,000 words long in terms of the reports. They're both about the top down and the very practical and the bottom up, but also some significant differences. So Tolstoy, although he was eligible, he lived long enough, he didn't get a Nobel Prize, whereas IPCC did get a Nobel Prize. But I can assure you, and anybody will endorse it who's been through an IPCC report, it was not the literature prize. That is absolutely for sure. But these are superficial ones. But there's another sort of deeper level, because War and Peace isn't just a kind of a soap opera. It also presents two alternative views of how history works and how human affairs work. And it's represented by the two main characters of the novel, who are friends, but are very distinct in character. So Pierre on the left, as you can see, is usually represented as a very scholarly academic type. And Andre on the right is more the person of action, who's going to treat things in a different way. And Pierre, for Pierre, history is the acts of great men and women. So in response to the Napoleonic Wars, he devises a plot to assassinate Napoleon and sort of solve the problem, all with one big top-down step. Whereas Andre kind of gets on with it. He's with the army. He fights at Borodino and Austerlitz, and is one part of you that history is seen as the outcome of the collective actions of millions of ordinary people. So very different views, but they are complementary. And I say Tolstoy prefers the Andre version of history to the Pierre one, but nevertheless, they are complementary in the novel and go together. And actually, the argument is, and I'll be picking up this, to deal with both climate change and COVID, we actually need both perspectives to deal with it. We do need that big global vision, but we also need to think about the practical, the Monday morning steps that need to be taken in order to advance the agenda. And that was quite an entertaining way of starting our first lead author meeting for the Working Group 3 report in this cycle, to remind people about that dual vision, to keep the vision but be practical at the same time. And that's really represented when more than 30 years ago, when the UN General Assembly welcomed IPCC's creation. It emphasized the act of producing coordinated scientific assessments, but it also enjoined it to produce realistic response strategies as well. So that duality, the big vision and the practicality, was there right for the beginning for IPCC. Now, the next 2 or 3 slides are going to be very much the Pierre sort of top-down kind of perspective on where we are globally in terms of climate change. And this picture is actually taken from the UNEP, the UN Environment Programme GAP report that comes out every year. In fact, something very similar has appeared in previous IPCC reports and will also appear in the next one. And what it is telling us is, yeah, sure, we've made a bit of progress over the last few years, in particular since the Paris Agreement, in you're reducing our expected level of emissions. The grey bar at the top shows where we would have been expected to be for global emissions by 2030, just a few years ago. The current policy and the unconditional nationally determined contributions show a reduction, so we have actually achieved something. But when we compare that with the bottom bands on this slide, the 2-degree range in blue, what you might call well below 2 degrees in yellow, and 1.5 degrees warming in green, there is a big, big gap between what we have achieved so far and what we need to do. And the size of that gap for 2 degrees warming is maybe about 1/4 to 1/3 of global emissions at the moment. And the gap, if you were going to go all the way for 1.5 degrees warming, is pretty much half of global emissions by 2030. So a big, big ask if we are going to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement. Next top-down one is to look at emission pathways that would be compatible with 1.5 degrees warming, and that came out in the report that we produced a couple of years ago. So the left-hand panel shows carbon dioxide emissions only. The authors reviewed almost 100 scenarios in the public domain that were roughly compatible with 1.5 degrees warming. And the blue bar shows basically the range of these scenarios, and there's a lot of variety within it. But the broad message that we came up with from this is if you're going to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, you would need to reach net zero emissions. In other words, you would need to take as much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere as you put in around the middle of the century. Obviously, uncertainties around that, but that's the rough ballpark figure. And if you look to the 2030 part of that diagram, roughly you're talking about a 45% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2030 compared with current levels, which of course is something that is far, far beyond the efforts that we've made so far. And I could talk more about, carbon dioxide isn't the only greenhouse gas. There are things like methane and nitrous oxide. And we would need to get these emissions down as well if we were to keep global warming to 1.5 degrees, but they will never fall down to zero. But they absolutely would need to decline during the 21st century. Now, this is a diagram that we've actually used a lot from that IPCC report. And it's really to kind of make the point that there is more than one way of keeping global warming below 1.5 degrees or any other level. So what each of these panels show, the solid blue line represents net carbon dioxide emissions. That's emissions minus the sinks, if you can take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. The grey bit represents emissions from fossil fuels and industry. The brown bit represents emissions or sinks from agriculture and land use. And the yellow bit, which applies much more in the pathways 3 and 4, is associated with BECC, so-called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And the message that's coming out of this diagram is that the choice is basically about how long you delay and how long you wait before starting radical action. So for example, in pathway 1, we see emissions falling by about 7% a year out to about 2030 or 2040. And that obviates the need to go to difficult technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. But if you delay, as in significantly as in pathway 4, it means you would need to rely on significant negative emissions in the second half of the 21st century. And that has problems, which I will come on to in just a second. But just to say, my personal view is that both of the extremes, the pathway 1 and pathway 4, are potentially really difficult to imagine happening. There are massive consequences in pathway 4 for food security and biodiversity from the implied use of bioenergy. And in pathway 1, the 7% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions per year, 7% is an estimate of the amount that emissions fell because of COVID in 2020. And to do that cumulatively and persistently for the next 10, 20 years is really a very, very big ask. So just to say, there are choices, but there are also very difficult choices involved in keeping warming to that kind of level. Now, to try to more the sort of the Andre view of the world, the bottom up and what specifically needs to happen, we talked about rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all systems. So, and this means that climate action would really needs to affect everybody. No one is excused. We can't make choices between different kinds of mitigation option. We need to exercise all the options given the ambition of the Paris targets. So it needs technological change, it needs behavioral change. We'd expect renewables to dominate electricity supply by 2050, and we'd expect coal to almost disappear from the electricity system by 2050. You can see oil and gas persisting longer, and in fact, you can imagine scenarios in which gas use rises by 2050. But we need deep cuts as well on the demand side in transport and in buildings, in the way that we use lands and the way that we plan our our cities and our infrastructure. So many, many things to happen. And it's a very important point to mention that these are not incremental changes on the edge of a current pathway of development. It implies big changes potentially in the way that we plan our societies and our economies. So that's there, but also most of the scenarios do involve some kind of carbon dioxide removal as part of them. All pathways use some kind of carbon dioxide removal, and that is needed to compensate for residual emissions from difficult sectors like heavy industry and aviation. But in many cases, it's also simply to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And as you can say, the use of technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage have potentially big implications for land use, food security, and biodiversity. And that was one of the reasons why the countries that make up IPCC were very concerned to have a special report on climate change and land in this cycle as well. This was a report that came out just over a year ago. And I don't want to go through it in an enormous amount of detail, but it was really to emphasize, I'm an energy person, and our working group got the job of managing the special report on climate change and land. And I am humbled, being an energy person, by the challenge of responses in the land sector, how they're needed and how difficult they can be to put in place, because they can involve millions, even billions of people who are involved with the land across the globe. So what the authors of the report did was they actually looked at response options in the land sector that did not involve competition for land. It was a way of managing land differently. And that includes agriculture, forests, the way we manage soils, for example, by managing soil carbon content, a number of issues, including fire management, which is extremely topical at the moment. But it also looked at issues on the demand side as well. What would happen if there was dietary change, or we started to manage food losses as well? And the very clear message from all of these different options is that they could help you fix just about every problem. They were win-win-win-win-win kind of measures. So they helped to mitigate change. They could help adapt to climate change as it took place. And it addressed issues like desertification and land degradation, which is a big concern in many parts of the less developed world. And finally, it would also have positive implications for food security. For example, agroforestry or improving crop yields would all help you there. The challenge came, to pick up from the previous part of it, when you look at mitigation measures that involve significant amounts of land use change. And that includes afforestation, it includes biochar, and it includes bioenergy, including bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And there was a much more ambiguous measure coming out, because it clearly, at the scale in that pathway 4 I just showed you, there were really, really big potential negative impacts. So it all came down to the scale at which you do it, what kind of land you selected for growing crops, what kind of crops you would grow, and the type of management system that you put in place. But a message that if you did it with best practice, you actually could have positive impacts. It would make a positive contribution to mitigating climate change. But if you did it in a very disorganized, unplanned way at a huge scale, then there were many, many negative implications from the exercise of these technologies. And since there are many business organizations that at the moment are promising net zero, but include the possibility of buying offsets to make up that target, we should remember that many of these offsets are actually buying mitigation options in the land use sector. So although this may not appear relevant to everybody, if you're purchasing offsets, this question about the sustainability of mitigation options in the land sector really, really does matter. So that was my incredibly fast speed through the sort of the IPCC and the global bit of it. I'm now going to switch to the COVID issue. And just to say, so this is very much short term. The previous slides looked out to 2100. This is sort of very near term stuff. So the International Energy Agency produced a report in the middle of this year, which suggested that global carbon dioxide emissions from energy would be 7% lower in 2020 as a result of reactions to the COVID crisis. And this is substantial. It's coincidentally the same annual rate of change you needed in that pathway 1 I mentioned earlier. Energy investment is down 18% across 2020. Now, that's not necessarily a good thing, because it may well be that investment in oil, gas, and coal has gone down, but so has investment in renewable energy. And there's been a very mixed impact on energy demand patterns. So one of the biggest effects has been on the use of public transport, because understandably, because of people's fears about social distancing. Private transport has also gone down, but has probably bounced back up again in many places. And demand for residential energy has gone up. And the IEA has identified that there are about 3 million energy sector jobs that are at risk or have been lost because of the COVID crisis. And just to say, not all of these jobs will be in the fossil fuel industry, though many of them will have been. But so there are other consequences as well. And just to be honest about it, we simply don't know what the medium to long-term consequences of the COVID crisis will be in terms of emissions. We could see some settled changes in people's behavior patterns, or we could simply bounce back to where we were already. Now, this brings us on to the green recovery issue. And again, this is taken from the International Energy Agency, which produced a green recovery report earlier in the year. And they were thinking about, where action that deals with climate change in the long term could actually fit into a COVID recovery. And they identified a number of different elements of a green recovery that would really be beneficial in all sorts of ways, creating jobs in the short term, helping to boost the economy, but in the longer term, helping to improve energy and sustainability. And just to flag there, I've picked out from a much bigger table a set of options that are almost universally beneficial in terms of contributing to a green recovery. And I would flag up that the buildings sector is probably the sector that really stands out as something where there are benefits. So retrofitting inefficient buildings, it would help with fuel poverty, it will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and it's a very rapid way of creating new employment as people go into retrofitting buildings. And appliance efficiency and clean cooking can also play their role. In the electricity sector, wind and solar PV, if we step these up, a very immediate near-term employment effects, and in the slightly longer term, expanding and modernizing grids so that we can integrate renewable energy into energy systems will be really important. And moving to electric vehicles in the transport sector is another one with clear benefits. No, maybe not so much in immediate jobs in the short term, but in terms of ultimately providing jobs for workers who've been displaced has potentially a big role to play. Now, these were issues that we thought about on the Scottish Just Transition Commission. We're working towards a report that will go to the Scottish ministers in the first quarter of next year, a final report. But we were asked by the Scottish Government to produce a very fast report by the end of July 2020 on the green recovery and how climate change and a just transition could fit into the COVID recovery. And you can just see the areas in which we produced recommendations. And echoing the International Energy Agency, investment in warm homes came to the top of the list. We were also keen on providing kind of support for public transport because it happens to be that Scotland is actually a big producer of, say, electric buses or hydrogen fuel cell buses. And we specifically recommended that the Scottish Government might think about procuring a fleet of electrical vehicles for COP26, which we'll be coming on to. In the rural economy, we identified clear employment opportunities for things like planting trees and also peatland restoration, because our peatlands could be a big store of carbon dioxide, and they now count in the national emission inventories. A big issue for Scotland has been the fact that many oil and gas workers have been put out of work because of the COVID crisis and the decline in oil prices. So a set of recommendations there about getting on with decommissioning the North Sea through plugging and abandoning old wells, but also gradually providing opportunities to move into the renewable energy sector with things like offshore wind or potentially hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. And a general sense that we need to think about skills development and the supply side of the labour market so that people, both young and old, can make a contribution to a net zero transition. And at the bottom, it says it's really important for governments to give a very clear sense of direction and attach conditions to any funding that will help to promote a green recovery and a just transition to net zero. Now, I'm going through this at the speed of light, but let me just finish on the COP26 side of it, which you've also been involved in. And I've headed this one, COP26 expectations management, because I think it's a big event, obviously, and that's not to take away from it at all. But any conference of the parties is part of a long drawn out process that requires patience. There are things happening that can run over several years. So what can we particularly expect out of COP26? Well, in theory, countries were supposed to submit new nationally determined contributions by the end of 2020. They're coming in slowly, and there will be a climate ambition summit to consider that at the beginning of December. But realistically, it may be into 2021 before many countries revise the pledges that they're putting in place. The Paris decision, though not the Paris Agreement itself, invites countries to look at mid-century strategies, and we should start to see some of these coming forward by the time we get to COP26. And so, for example, the Chinese pledge to reach net zero by 2060 was a very special and particular development there that relates to the mid-century horizon, as well as the NDCs, which apply for the year 2030. This is real anorak stuff. The next one, the Paris Rule Book. But the rule book for implementing the Paris Agreement was supposed to be fixed by now. It was supposed to be fixed by COP25 last year in Madrid. It wasn't. And the particular gap there refers to Article 6, which is basically about emission trading and sharing mitigation outcomes between countries. And the rules around that have been particularly difficult to establish. And it would actually, it's not going to catch the headlines, but it would be a real achievement if the UK presidency could pull that one off. And the final thing I want to flag there is to remember what the 3 Paris goals are. The Paris does not just have a goal of limiting warming to well below 2 degrees, pursuing efforts towards 1.5. The Paris Agreement has 2 other goals on fostering climate resilience, which many developing countries care about very much, but also urges developed countries to make sure that financial flows are consistent with the other objectives and contribute to them. And I have to say one thing with the Friends of COP26 group, one of the strong messages it got across to the UK government was that all 3 of these goals were interlocking and you needed to pursue each of them. Initially, the UK government was very focused on goal number 1, which is absolutely necessary. But to get other countries to come in behind that first goal, you're also going to need to make progress on the other 2 if countries are going to sign up the NDCs. For example, many developing countries in their NDCs have said that their emission objectives are dependent on achieving goals in terms of financial flows. So there's an interdependence between these different elements. And this is the last substantive slide, just a few key dates leading up to COP26. And just to say, as I emphasized, COP26 is part of a progress. So there's lots of stuff going on. So in the next couple of weeks, we will be starting a so-called periodic review of the long-term global goal, which is the well below 2 degree thing. And this review will actually run right through COP26 and beyond. 9th of December, the Committee on Climate Change is going to produce its 6th carbon budget report with recommendations for the mid-2030s, and may well say something about the 5th carbon budget, which applies to around 2030, as that will be a necessary part of progress towards net zero mid-century. And the UK government then has 3 days to absorb that before taking it to a so-called Climate Ambition Summit, which is being put together by the UK, France, and the Climate Convention with partnership of Chile and Italy. And that is where many countries will be invited to step up and declare their advanced NDCs, and also businesses will be invited to there. If they have significant things to announce, they may well get a role in that Climate Ambition Summit as well. Middle of next year, as well as the COPs, the Framework Convention has intersessional sessions, so there will be more progress made in the middle of next year before we move on to COP26 at the beginning of November. Now, I do know that there are many business people on this call, indeed the main audience. Just to say, I think the UK government announced either yesterday or today 4 corporate sponsors for COP26, who are SSE, Scottish Power, National Grid, and the NatWest Group. And the UK government is actually looking for other kinds of support as well from business to get behind the COP26 agenda. So if any business people are on the call, please do get in touch with the COP26 unit in the Cabinet Office, because they would love to hear from you moving forward. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you for listening to this extraordinarily speedy, tour de horizon around all the issues around climate change, COVID, COP26. I hope I've emphasized the fact that we do need a global vision on this, but we also do need to think about practical Monday morning kind of steps to move us in the right direction. And I look forward for the next sort of 25 minutes or so of discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. I'll turn my video back on so you can see me. Thank you. Thank you for covering that kind of war and peace amount of content in the time it takes to listen to a short podcast. That really is something, and a really entertaining opening. I really enjoyed that. So I think we're going to have a lot of questions covering lots of different areas as per your presentations. I'm going to try and group them together. And I'm going to start, if it's okay, with that kind of worldview, one of those first diagrams you showed us, where the gap between the current pathway that we're on and a 1.5 pathway was quite stark. And I'm just going to ask a question of kind of where you left off as well, highlighting this 12th of December summit that's coming up. The UK government and Chile and France are hosting. What do you think we can expect from that summit? And you kind of alluded to it a little bit, in terms of, countries coming forward with ambition. We've obviously seen a smattering of net zero commitments in the last months, but and China's in particular, very exciting. But what do you think we can expect from that summit and going forward next year? And particularly here, I've got a question from Paul Dinsdale, who's asking about the kind of contributions of China and India, so those developing countries. What kind of contribution can we expect from them, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of things like net zero for mid-century, that's almost the easy bit. It's quite easy for politicians to make declarations for what might happen, 25 or 30 years down the line. The tough bit is actually to come up with the pledges for the next 5 to 10 years that set you on the right path. Because unless you get on the right path, you're going to close down the options, and net zero by, mid-century will not be a possibility. So I think the hope at things like the Climate Ambition Summit is what countries are going to come up with for 2030 on that, or 2035, that kind of time horizon, the kind of things you need to get on with immediately. And so very obviously, to pick up on the point about China and India, what China did was a pledge for 2060. But actually, their pledge for 2030 that they made at the same time did not move onwards. It was still hoping to have their emissions peak by 2030 or perhaps earlier, which is something that they had announced before. So I think the hope is, when countries like China come to the Climate Ambition Summit, that they maybe say something a bit more about 2030. India and China, I would not put in the same bag at all. India has got a big issue around its persistent level of coal use, and it's probably stickier than it is in China, to tell the truth. And India has actually, its NDC relies to a huge extent about afforestation. It's a big part of it, but they have a very, very conditional NDC. So they are sending messages about financial flows coming in as well. So that's the connectivity of the three different Paris goals. And of course, the thing that we won't see by the 9th of December, but we might see after the 20th of January, is where the US might fit into the picture, because obviously we would expect the US will be coming back into the Paris Agreement, and what they do during 2021, I think, will be particularly critical.
Excellent. Well, we might come back to some of those themes, but let's go back to the start on IPCC specifically, because we have a couple of questions here. So we have one just at the start on the sixth assessment report, which I understood is the kind of the group of reports that will be released in 2021 and the synthesis report in 2022. But maybe you could just clarify that for Shelley. This first question here.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
And the second question then is a great question from an anonymous attendee, a mystery attendee here. But they ask, how much of a threat or an opportunity do you see rising populism is for the science of the IPCC? And I guess the kind of credibility of the IPCC's guidance.
Yeah, so on the factual stuff, and obviously we've been hit by COVID as much as everybody else, but work is continuing on the sixth assessment cycle, and we're basically working virtually, and we'd be hoping to get back into physical meetings in next spring or summer to carry the process. Unfortunately, that means we are slightly delayed. So the schedule still says the Working Group 1 report on science will come out in the middle of next year if they can have a physical approval session. But unfortunately, neither the Working Group 2 nor 3 reports will come out before COP26. So Working Group 3 will actually come out first, sometime around the turn of 2021, 2022. And it will be into 2022 before we see the Working Group 2 report on impacts. And sadly, that's just the impact. Our developing country scientists have been really struggling with things like digital connectivity to keep in place. And on the question of populism, populism varies country by country. I mean, patently, as we all know, the US is a very divided place at the moment, and the two halves of the US take very, very different positions on climate change. So I think obviously we know who's won the election, so roughly the direction it's going to go. But the US continues to, in the longer term is an issue. But of course, populism is also running in countries like Brazil as well, and that's an issue given Brazil's big importance in the picture, and we see how it plays out. But actually, one of the strengths of the Paris agreements is that it's bottom up and not top down. It's built on individual contributions, and if you have Europe, China, the US making significant pledges, I think you have the critical mass, to move forward on. Maybe it's not enough yet to make sure that we keep within the Paris warming limits, but it certainly takes us in the right direction, I think. If you have that proportion of global emissions in the world's population covered, it is a source of some optimism.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe to link to another question we've got here, perhaps the other side of the coin in terms of global trends that we've seen during the COVID pandemic is the public's understanding now of data and science and the importance of it, especially here in the UK, people kind of looking at the numbers, listening to the daily briefings. So what do you think that, the pandemic has demonstrated that public interest in science and data, and what lessons do you think we can learn for the way governments and international institutions communicate climate science in the future?
Well, experts were having a hard time for a while, but now experts appear to be coming back into fashion again as people who might be listened to, with some nuances around that. But broadly speaking, people I think are listening to experts. And I have to say, it's interesting looking at things like the UK Citizens Assembly, where people who've been involved with that, who may not have been naturally enthusiastic or even slightly resistant about climate change action, have had their minds changed by being confronted by the facts, as it were. So that, I think, is a sign of optimism. And really, I think the debate about climate change action, it's moved on to whether climate change is real or whether humans have had an influence. I think that's well established. I think the tricky bit, when it comes more to policy and the politics of it, is when people get a sense of the ambition of the measures that would be needed to actually achieve the warming limits in Paris, because it is not incremental, it's not marginal, it's big stuff. So we're already getting the hints about bringing forward by 5 years the fact that we will not have petrol engine vehicles being sold anymore in the UK. And that's not the only thing that needs to happen. And I think it's once these things come through, that's the real test of the political, action, the support for it.
Absolutely, but that's why I assume you think the work that you're doing on the Just Transition Commission is so important, because I think there was research out today by the European Climate Foundation and a number of others that showed that people support climate action and even support paying for climate action as long as the distribution of those costs are fairly distributed. And I think there were kind of links to what happened in France, the Gilets jaunes movement that wasn't necessarily reacting to the climate policy as a bad thing, but the impacts and the potentially perceived or actual distribution impacts.
Yeah, one of the lines we're kind of taking with the Just Transition Commission is, of course, we're not thinking about a fair world which will be made unfair by climate change action. The world is already a very unfair and inequitable place. And the question will be, can you actually use climate change action to address some of these inequalities that would potentially get bigger buy-in? And we can identify all sorts of issues. In Scotland, we identified the question of rural communities who may suffer from problems with digital connectivity. For example, that's an issue. If homes away from the gas network are using electricity, we actually add all the cost of renewable energy subsidies, though we might not need them anymore, to the price of electricity. So people who are reliant on electricity are bearing an unfair part of the cost. All sorts of issues like access to public transport come in there as well. So these are the kind of issues you need to think about. I mean, can you use climate action to address some of these issues issues as well to make the world a fairer place. But it's worth saying, I mean, COVID is a real challenge because it's exacerbating existing inequalities. You look at the labour market, people like me and probably you, if I can make the judgment, you know, who can work from home and a fairly, you know, and almost be more productive after COVID than they were before, is very different people who have to travel into work. You know, all the rest of it, or have been made unemployed. So there's a real challenge here about the inequalities of COVID and how to address it.
Absolutely. Love to keep going on this vein, but I think we've got quite a lot of questions around the role of non-state actors. So in particular, we've got one here on kind of the role of business and how science can help businesses set, ambitious climate targets, net zero targets is obviously what lots of businesses are trying to set. You mentioned earlier that the role of offsets, and businesses might not be aware of the implications of offsets that they're buying. So could you kind of give your guidance on what a robust net zero target or strategy plan for a business would?
Yeah. I mean, one thing to say is when you look at net zero is in the Paris Agreement as an absolutely global target, and just because the world is net zero doesn't mean that every sector in every country has to be net zero. We'd expect some people to have residual emissions and other people to make up for it. And in that sense, offsets do have a role to play to balance that out, that out globally. But I would observe that I just see if there's a market for offsets, there are an awful lot more buyers than sellers out there at the moment, which I think is going to be challenging. And it may be naive to think that offsets are going to come cheap in the future, when the ambition of climate action goes up and there's a big demand for offsets. So I do think you need to be extremely careful in setting your net zero and how the treatment of offsets, where are they going to come from? How are you going to evaluate the quality of the offsets in terms that they give genuine reductions in emissions is going to be absolutely critical. But just to say, I think the role of business in this is absolutely critical. And I think after the Paris Agreement, you could really see the dial shifting. The penny dropped in lots of boardrooms saying, actually, this climate change thing is really serious. And, I think we really absolutely need to encourage the kind of action that we're starting to see. So when you saw people like SSE, Scottish Power, National Grid and NatWest, standing up and sponsoring COP26, they were only allowed to do it because they had credible plans behind it. You cannot come in with a carelessly put together plan. It's got to be very carefully put together. And I would also mention, while we're talking about other stakeholders, the role of cities, urban, especially in the States, in the US, cities and states have a big role to play in terms of advancing action. And worthwhile saying that most of the just transition activities that you see globally are not national. They're taking place at the regional level, places like Silesia, the Ruhr, Asturias, Scotland as the kind of level that is appropriate probably to take action.
Absolutely. And we actually had a question here on your message to major city leaders for COP26. And I think you just spoke to that as well. And another stakeholder is investors, of course, who are a big lever over businesses. But what would your specific messages be to city leaders and investors? Yeah,
well, on city leaders but basically to kind of get on with it. I mean, the interesting thing about cities, national governments tend to be siloed and the transport part is different from the planning part. I think in many cities, the connections are between different functions are much closer. So a mayor in the United States can think about how you coordinate energy supply in the city with transport patterns, with planning, with waste management, etc. It's a good scale at which to do that kind of joined up planning. So I think encouraging that, and if that can be done in the UK as well, thinking about Manchester, London, etc., that's going to be successful. On investors, I mean, given the objective of increasing financial flows, that's part of the Paris Agreement, they're critical because financial flows does not just mean governments handing over money. It can be money that's leveraged from the private sector in order to get things moving. And there is debate about that, but it's definitely part of the picture. And one of the things, I mean, I've talked at quite a lot of meetings of, say, the Institutional Investors Group for Climate Change. And I just find the level of interest very high, because many of the new kind of initiatives that you need are very capital intensive, you know, big offshore wind farms, solar energy. And these are things that are well suited to long-term patient investment, coming from things like insurance companies and pension funds. And the capacity to bring them into the picture, I think is really worthwhile. But some of the biggest challenges for finance, just to throw one out, is that the investors like big projects where you can make decisions all at once. But many of the things we need to do are small scale, like an energy efficiency, household by household, planting trees at the farm level, etc. And the big challenge is how you package together these possibilities into packages that are juicy enough to be interesting for investors. So the question of aggregating these measures and finding ways of getting the big money go towards small scale projects, I think is a huge challenge.
Yeah, as you say the Monday morning tasks. I like that idea. Not that retrofitting is that easy either. We actually have a question here on retrofitting, which I think it's actually on the EU Renovate programme, their big renovation wave, and I think you alluded to it. But do you see that as a kind of transformational policy that would allow, you know, building efficiency? Is that a big part of a green recovery package?
It's the most obvious no-brainer, because the IEA slide I showed had all the green blobs on it. It ticks all the boxes because it reduces carbon dioxide emissions, it keeps people in fuel poverty, improves the quality of their lives, and it also creates jobs very quickly. So if we can work on building up supply chains in that area and have a kind of planned level activity, I think, you know, everybody is interested in that at the EU level, at the UK level, at the Scottish level, where I'm very familiar. They're very keen to get on with that, and it's one of the highest priorities. So completely endorse Fred Stewart's question. I think it was Fred that did that. Yeah.
Excellent. Oh, we've got so many good ones to get through. I've just got a very quick one here. The role of public procurement potentially to stimulate some of that kind of demand and then the investment.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's part of the picture. I mean, we have so much to cover here, but public procurement is critical. So if you're thinking things like, you know, fleets of electric vehicles, you know, things like councils, or government departments, they have the opportunity to go there and stimulate new markets and sort of help to bring us down the cost curve by getting these new markets going. So public procurement, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, all of the ideas are coming in. I'm just going to say tick. Yeah, get on with it.
All of these things.
Yeah.
So we've only got 4 minutes left, and so I'm just going to ask this last one, I guess, from Sam Stevens about how we inspire public action. And also, of course, voting for climate-friendly policies. So in Scotland, you know, year to go, how do we engage the public that are going to be around this conference in Glasgow? How do you engage the UK public at large in this big event? And also lead that to them being engaged and taking actions themselves, those Monday morning steps. Yeah,
well, believe me, I think the Cabinet Office has engaged plenty of consultants to help it think about this very issue. And obviously, one advantage of a thing like COP26, any conference of the parties, it really stimulates local interest. And the government that hosts it has an obligation to stand up and demonstrate its credentials. So this is absolutely really important for the UK, what happens over the next 12 months or so. And I think it's a mixture of things. I mean, I do think the climate assembly ideas are really useful, and we should be doing a bit with them in terms of publicity, but just, you know, carrying it out more widely, just making sure that there are articles in there, and making sure that all the newspapers are picking it up, not just the Guardian. Daily Mail as well. The Daily Telegraph would be an achievement, but the Daily Mail is definitely definitely a target there for moving it forward.
Yeah, for public engagement. Excellent. Thank you, Jim. And I think it also remains for me to say, as you said yourself, the UK COP unit is very much looking to engage businesses. So all of you that turn up to the call today, and I can also happily kind of facilitate connections. They've got a lot of different campaigns, but their premier business ask is really to set that science-based target, a robust net zero strategy. And that's one of the kind of barriers to entry that we'd like to kind of challenge all of you to take on, to set a science-based target, and many more things connected to that. So I'm going to hand back over to Caroline, but yeah, thank you again, Jim. What a tour de force. Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely echo that. You covered such a wide range of issues, Jim, but thank you also, Emily, for getting through so many of those questions, and we managed to cover off loads there as well. Thank you also to everyone who joined us, whether over Zoom or YouTube or the other social media streams. Beyond the Green Recovery Festival, if you're interested in finding out what the crowd has planned for 2021, including our own activities around COP26, do get in touch with myself or a colleague at the crowd. And once again, thank you very much to our sponsors, the Charities Aid Foundation, Adnams, and the RIBA for supporting this event and others. But thank you so much, Jim. Thank you, Emily. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing everyone at another event over the next couple of weeks.